With the introduction of the Tiger 1 and the Tiger 2, the regular good old Sherman was slowly becoming obsolete. Even with the EZ8 variant of the Sherman, the fact remains that these things were poorly armored and the 76mm was slowly becoming less effective. So back at the home island, American forces thought of totally new designs, with multiple designs ending up leaving the paper they were drawn on. This is the story of the T25, also known as T25 Pilot 1. Before we get into the T25, we need more backstory. As you might have already seen, the hull of the T25s looks familiar, now doesn't it? That's right, it's the hull of a T23 medium tank. Introduced in 1943, the T23 medium tank was a compact tank, with a length of 5.7 meters, a width of 3 meters, and standing 2.4 meters tall. This tank was even smaller than an M4 Sherman. It performed fine, but for all the good points the vehicle had, there were drawbacks as well. Over time, 250 T-23 tanks were built, but all of them would never see service. The Army ground forces didn't like the idea of the fact that they had to train 5 crew members for another new tank, and since the production of the M4 was still up, Army ground forces wouldn't like the fact that the production would be disrupted. To top it off, the design had poor weight distribution, which made the ground pressure pretty high. And because of a new electrical transmission system, the tank was abandoned. Essentially, 2 more prototypes were ordered, a T-23E3 and a T-23E4. The T-23E4 would have a horizontal volute suspension, but the T-23E4 was cancelled before the design was completed. The T-23E3, with its torsion bar suspension, did manage to create at least one prototype. All of the T-23s would mount the same 76mm guns and a 7.62 coaxial machine gun. And even with the success of the new suspension, the T-23 was never adopted for service. Now we are at the stage of the T-25 Pilot 1. As shown, it used a modified T-23 hull with a new turret. The gun chosen for this turret was a 90mm anti-tank gun. This leads to a pretty funny coincidence, because this means that the T-25 mounted the same gun as the M36. I talked about it in an earlier video of mine. Keep in mind, the M36 was already seeing combat by now, with the 90mm, with armor thickness of around 76mm on the hull and 88mm on the turret. This thing had more armor than a Sherman, but was no great threat to German tankers. Also, there were 2 prototypes. One that had a torsion bar suspension, and the other had a horizontal volute spring suspension, just like with the T-23. With all the 40 prototypes built, the tank was simply the worst. It had competed with the well-known M26 Pershing. Besides being identical, the M26 had better armor than the T-25. Therefore, the T-25 was cancelled. Also, the Army ground forces didn't like the idea for tanks to mount 90mm guns, as one-on-one tank duels should be the job for a tank destroyer like the M36. The M26 though did see a better end. With a long discussion and struggle, Office of Ordnance and Army ground forces allowed the T26E3 to be produced with a 76mm installed. It was standardized as M26 heavy tank. Although the discussion of the M26 being a heavy or a medium tank is debatable, the result was clear. All the 40 built T-25s were left in cold storage and never reached the front. And to my knowledge, none survived to this day. Even if the T-25 did somehow got to the front, the fact remains that the electric transmission would be too complex for field mechanics to repair. And that wraps up the story of the T-25 medium tank. I think that was simply the worst option to choose. Even in World of Tanks Blitz, the thing sucks. But you may have noticed that I said the end of the T-25 medium tank, because there's more. If you remember, there were plans to make tank destroyers based off the chassis of the T-25. These are known as T-25-2 and T-25AT. Both can be found in online tank games. But even those tank destroyers were never built, and the T-25 with all its tank destroyer variants were lost to history and never really got much attention and popularity among the tank community. But is that deserved or not? And what do you guys think about the T25? Is it better or worse than the M26? Leave it down in the comments. Also, if you enjoyed this video and want to see more historical content, feel free to subscribe, like and share the video with a fellow tanker. And I'll be seeing you all in the next one.